My wife left my house to live with my brother and took my daughters with her, thinking I would submit, but my family supported me and they lived through a living hell. I remember it as if it were yesterday. My life was pretty calm before all of this. I had my job, my house, my daily routine, and a family that, although somewhat distant at times, I knew would always be there when needed. But everything changed one rainy autumn afternoon when my brother and his new wife showed up at my door asking for help. My brother, Javier, and I had never been what you could call best friends. We always had this sense that he lived in his own world while I focused on building mine. And although, of course, we loved each other, we never had that close connection that many siblings share. I was always the one who worked hard, the one who made sure things were done right, while he was the one who made impulsive decisions, often without thinking about the consequences. The worst part was that his life seemed to be full of emergencies that he caused himself. And, as always, he'd end up asking for my help to get out of them. That afternoon, he called me to say that he and his wife, Valeria, had nowhere else to live. The situation was serious, according to him, and they needed a place to stay for a while, just a few weeks until they could find something permanent. "Just a few weeks, bro. It won't be a problem for you, I promise," he said with that voice he always used when he wanted me to believe him. Although something told me that this story had more to do with an emergency than what it seemed, I couldn't say no. I had done it before on other occasions. And of course, I knew that Valeria, his wife, came from a wealthy family and had always lived a much different lifestyle than mine. Somehow, I was convinced that she felt uncomfortable with the limitations of my simple, modest life, but of course, I didn't say anything. I agreed to let them stay, even though there was a vague feeling of distrust in the back of my mind. My house was big enough and I knew there was space, so my heart told me I couldn't do to them what, at that moment, seemed like a betrayal. So I let them in. The first few days were normal. At first, the idea of having them in my house didn't seem that bad. Valeria, despite her airs of grandeur, was polite, calm, and behaved like a respectful guest. Javier, my brother, started taking on some of the household chores, cooking, helping with tasks, and doing what seemed like an idea of family balance. But little by little, small things started happening that made me uncomfortable. Like when they started rearranging the furniture without asking, or when Valeria began deciding what groceries we should buy for the week without asking me if I had something in mind. At first, I felt silly for getting upset over such things. Wasn't it just trivial stuff? However, as the days went by, my perception started to change. What bothered me the most was that they didn't seem to realize that they were invading my space. Javier had started taking certain liberties, like using my car without asking, and even, on a couple of occasions, moving my things around. It was as if everything belonged to them, as if it didn't matter that this house had been mine from the start, that I had made all the sacrifices to keep it. They would come in with their presence, and in less than a week, the house started to feel like it wasn't mine anymore. But I kept quiet. I still tried to justify their actions. After all, they were in a tough spot, right? No stable job, financial troubles, and living in the most expensive city in the country. And, as always, I was the responsible brother. But the discomfort was growing, and although I didn't voice it, I started to feel more and more trapped in a role I hadn't asked for. The provider, the one who always had to shoulder everyone else's problems. Javier, at first grateful, began giving me advice about my life, about how I should make better use of my time, as if I were the one who needed guidance. Sometimes he'd joke about how easy my life seemed, compared to his. Over time, the tone became more insistently passive-aggressive. At dinners, Valeria would start making comments about how simplistic my lifestyle was, how wasted my time seemed, and although she didn't say it outright, she began questioning my decisions, from how I ran the house to the smaller things, how I decorated, how I organized my schedule. Everything I had done for years started being criticized as though my life was a project that needed to be fixed. The worst came one day when, after a small altercation in the kitchen, in which my brother was visibly upset over something trivial, I heard him say, "Enough already, right? I'm tired of living by your rules all the time. You need to stop being so controlling." It was like a punch in the stomach. I felt like I was being attacked in an unfair way, as if I were becoming the villain in my own life, just because I had tried to be kind and help. At this point, I no longer felt comfortable in my own home. Although I tried to pretend everything was fine, I began to doubt my brother and his wife's true intentions. The house that once made me feel secure now seemed to be filled with an invisible tension that I couldn't ignore. I tried to stay calm, to not let my emotions get the better of me, but something told me that all of this was going to end badly. Something inside me was screaming that things were going to take a turn I wouldn't like. What had I done wrong? How could I have been so blind? How much longer could I take this? The questions kept me awake at night. Something was brewing, and I didn't know if I was ready for what was coming. The following days were a strange mix of discomfort and desperation. Although I tried to stay calm, I felt that it was becoming harder and harder to live with Javier and Valeria in my house. The atmosphere, which had once been calm and familiar, began to feel heavy, filled with unspoken tension. Small annoyances started to pile up, but the worst part was that I was starting to convince myself that maybe I was overreacting, that I should be more understanding and just accept the situation. After all, it had been my offer to help them out. But deep down, there was something that told me this wasn't just about kindness or generosity. Something told me they didn't see this as a temporary help situation, but rather as something they felt entitled to. Every time Valeria would intervene in the kitchen or suggest changes to how I should organize the house, I felt like the line between being an invited guest and an inmate was beginning to blur. It wasn't just that they were offering their opinions. It felt like they were trying to take control of everything that had been mine until then. One night, after a meal I had put a lot of effort into preparing, Valeria, without even looking my way, started speaking in a tone I hadn't heard before. It was different, more authoritative, like she was giving instructions rather than just sharing an opinion. She commented on how messy the guest room was, the one where Javier and she had been staying. My mind went blank and my stomach twisted. That room had always been spotless because it was the one I used when I had guests over. But to her, it no longer seemed good enough. And that was just the beginning. As the days passed, more irritating behaviors began to surface. Javier started speaking about money more directly, like he no longer cared about the consequences of his words. "Hey bro, don't you think it's fair that we pay something for staying here?" he said one morning while we were having coffee in the kitchen. I was stunned, as if I had just been slapped. "Pay? What are you talking about?" I replied, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Couldn't believe it. They were here because they had nowhere else to go, not because they were looking for a place where the rules were different. He shrugged and added, "It's just that it doesn't feel right living here for free. Don't you think it's the least I can do?" The response that followed hurt more than I expected. I could feel the pressure building inside me, my chest tightening at the thought that they were now expecting me to pay for their stay, something I never imagined would be up for discussion. The idea that my own family, who had taken refuge under my roof, was now treating me like a landlord, made me feel a mix of anger and disappointment. At first, I tried to ignore it, brush it off as a joke or misunderstanding. But the next day, Valeria repeated the same thing. We were having lunch together, and she mentioned how uncomfortable she felt not doing anything around the house. According to her, it was normal for people staying in someone else's house to contribute financially, at least to avoid feeling like a burden. That night, after dinner, I locked myself in my room. I couldn't stop thinking about those words and what they meant. What used to be a warm home now felt like a prison, and I was the one who had built its walls. The idea of asking them to leave started to pop into my mind, but then doubt crept in. How could I do something so drastic after having opened my doors to them? Yet, at the same time, I wondered if I was being foolish for not setting clearer boundaries from the start. I had been the first to give in, to offer them a place to stay, but now everything seemed to have taken an unexpected turn, one where I was losing control. The following weekend, the situation became even more tense. Javier came up to me again, this time with a serious look, as though he were about to ask for something important. "Bro, I think it's time we talk about something serious," he began, sitting down across from me. "It's just so you're not uncomfortable, but I was thinking that maybe we should start contributing with a rent payment. We could pay you, something symbolic." That was the point of no return. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The stress, the pressure, and the discomfort I was feeling made me take a quick, almost impulsive decision. At that moment, I knew that the rules of the house had to change, and that I couldn't keep allowing them to treat me as though I owed them everything without getting anything in return. What hurt the most was that it wasn't really about the money. What truly affected me was the fact that my own family now saw me as an endless resource, as if everything I had worked for, was something they could take for granted. It was no longer just about money, it was about respect, and I was determined not to allow myself to be treated that way. The real question now was, how was I going to deal with this without losing the little piece I had left? How would I face Javier and Valeria without the situation escalating into an irreparable conflict? And, perhaps most importantly, how would I deal with the fact that, in the process, I might have to confront people I had once considered my allies? I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was shifting in my life. Every conversation with Javier and Valeria felt more loaded, like we were walking on a tightrope. The worst part was that I wasn't sure how we had even gotten to this point. It all started so simply. I offered them a place in my home, I lent a hand when they needed it most, and now, somehow, we were caught in a silent war. The first real clash with Javier came when, during what seemed like an innocent conversation about the household, he casually mentioned that he and Valeria thought it would be more fair if they started contributing something financially. I just stared at him, shocked. Fair? How could that be fair when they weren't even helping out with basic chores around the house? My mind began to process what was happening, but my heart was still trying to find some excuse to justify the unjustifiable. After all, if they were really struggling, wasn't I supposed to be the good brother, the good son, the good man who helps? But that justification started crumbling over time. I realized I wasn't being considerate but naive. Javier and Valeria hadn't just moved into my house. They were slowly but surely shaping it according to their will. There was a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, but it was there, in every corner of the house. Their presence. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement anymore. My house, my personal space, my sanctuary had been invaded. The money talk started becoming more frequent. At first, it felt like Valeria would just throw out random comments, as if it were nothing serious, but little by little, her words began to carry an intention. "Hey, why don't you hire someone to help with the cleaning? You could, right?" she said to me one evening, and I couldn't help but think how absurd the suggestion was. Of course, I could, but why should I? We already had enough with the fact that they weren't contributing in any way. But the worst moment came one morning. I had had a long, exhausting week at work, and when I came home, I found out that Javier had been using my car without asking. Valeria had also rearranged the living room. The first thing that hit me was a mix of anger and frustration. It wasn't about the car or the living room. It was about the invasion of my life, my spaces. My home, the one place I'd always considered my refuge, was no longer mine alone. Everything had changed. The rules of living together had been broken without me even realizing it. In an attempt to regain some peace, I asked Javier to please stop using my car without permission. "I didn't have another option," he replied, as if he couldn't understand what was bothering me. The lack of respect for my belongings, my time, my boundaries, started eating at me. I couldn't believe I was putting up with this just because I didn't want to start a fight. But something inside me was changing. I was becoming more and more irritable, more exhausted, and the tension was starting to affect my health. Every time I saw them, I thought about everything I had lost, about how my generosity had been reduced to a mere obligation. I no longer wanted to be the compliant brother, the son who always gave, always accepted, without receiving anything in return. I was done being the one to support everyone else while I had no one to lean on. One afternoon, after a particularly tense conversation with Valeria about the rent payments, I decided that enough was enough. I could no longer ignore what was happening. Despite the fear of what might come, I knew this was the moment to stand up for what was left of my life, my space, my dignity. The next day, I gathered my courage and asked them to sit down in the living room. I knew at that moment that this would be the breaking point. I couldn't pretend anymore that everything was fine. I had to be honest, tell them how I really felt, without fear of being called selfish or insensitive. What I was about to say wouldn't be easy, but I knew it was the right thing to do. I was tired of bearing a situation that no longer benefited me. And even though my heart was pounding harder than ever, I couldn't take a step back. I couldn't keep being the person who always gave in, who put their needs aside to meet everyone else's expectations. My family shouldn't be ruining my life like this. I was preparing for the worst because I knew, deep down, that things would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson I needed to learn. Not everything we do for others will always be reciprocated. The day had come. I had spent the whole weekend preparing my mind and body for what I had to do. I didn't want it to end in a brutal confrontation, but the tension that had been building up over the past few weeks had become unbearable. Every time I entered the house, I could feel the discomfort in the air, like a gray cloud hanging over us, ready to explode. I couldn't ignore the growing distance between us anymore. Something had to be said plainly and honestly. My parents always taught me that when something's wrong, you say it, no matter how painful it is. And now, I was about to face the toughest situation of my life. I sat on the couch, my nerves eating me alive. Javier was in the kitchen, playing with his phone, and Valeria was in the living room, flipping through a magazine. I tried to stay calm, but my hands were shaking slightly. I had to be firm. I had to set a clear boundary for all that was going on. Javier, Valeria, we need to talk, I finally said, my voice sounding more confident than I felt. I couldn't help but look at both of them, searching for signs of surprise or concern. But they both seemed calm, almost unaware of what was about to happen. They both looked up, and that was all I needed. What was coming couldn't be negotiated. I took a deep breath and, without hesitation, I began. I'm tired. I can't keep doing this. I'm not okay with what's happening. I'm not okay with how we're treating each other. I've done everything I can to make sure we're okay, to make sure we have a roof over our heads, food, support. But this is not what I signed up for, I said without thinking twice. There was an uncomfortable silence. Valeria put the magazine down and stared at me. Javier furrowed his brows and put his phone down on the table. Immediately, the first sparks of discomfort began to show in their eyes. What do you mean? Javier asked, his voice defensive, as if he already knew what was coming. What I mean is that I can't keep doing this. I don't care if you came here claiming that you're going through a rough time, but this is not a hotel. I can't keep putting up with you taking advantage of me. I'm exhausted, I replied, feeling each word come out with a force I didn't even know I had. There was an awkward silence. Valeria looked at the floor, and Javier kept clenching and unclenching his fists. I felt a growing pressure in my chest, like I was fighting against something bigger than myself, but at the same time, I knew there was no turning back. That's not fair, Valeria said, raising her gaze with some frustration. What did you expect? For us to come and just do nothing? We need help, we're struggling, and you have a house. What are we supposed to do? Not everything is as easy as it seems from your side. I'm not asking you to do everything, Valeria, I replied, trying to keep my calm. What I'm asking for is respect. Respect for my space, respect for my time, respect for my life. And I can't take it anymore. You're taking advantage of my goodwill, and that has a limit. The atmosphere became dense, almost palpable. The air was thick with tension. Both of them stayed quiet, unable to respond immediately. The discomfort of the situation was so obvious that I felt like the whole world's weight was on my shoulders. What would happen next? Would they understand, or would they get even angrier? If you're not willing to contribute, to change the dynamic a bit, then you'll have to leave, I said, my words coming out harsher than I expected. But by this point, it didn't matter how it sounded. I had been too patient, too accommodating, and now there was no room to keep giving in. It wasn't an ultimatum out of malice, but out of the need to protect myself. Javier seemed on the verge of exploding. He stood up from the chair and started pacing back and forth, trying to calm himself down. Valeria, on the other hand, didn't say a word. Her eyes filled with a mix of surprise and anger. It was clear she hadn't expected this response, but even though she didn't say it out loud, I could tell that deep down, the truth was hitting her hard. I'm sorry, really? Valeria said, almost whispering. We didn't know how to ask for help without seeming like we were asking too much. I understand, but that doesn't change what's happened, I replied, with a calmness that only I knew wasn't natural. Now we have to make decisions. And those decisions affect everyone. Javier finally stopped pacing and looked at me for a few seconds. I could see that there was no turning back now. The situation was changing, and even though it wasn't easy for any of us, we all knew the cards were on the table. The atmosphere was still tense, but now it was no longer just my battle. It was ours. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was winning. The following days were a torment, not because of what I said or the words I had shared with them, but because the reaction or the lack of one hit me harder than I had expected. At first, everything seemed calm, as though the conversation hadn't had the impact it should have. However, what was really happening was much more complex than my mind had anticipated. Javier wouldn't look me in the eye. The anger on his face was evident, but he wouldn't say a word. Instead, his responses were limited to monosyllables, his body always tense, as though he were about to explode, but he didn't want to give me the satisfaction of showing it. On the other hand, Valeria, with her calculating and sometimes passive-aggressive attitude, remained distant. Her indifference was almost palpable, but I could see beyond that. The silence that had settled between us grew heavier every day. Every time I entered the kitchen or ran into either of them in the hallway, there was an uncomfortable feeling in the air, something we couldn't ignore. Then, one afternoon, it all exploded. It was just a regular Tuesday, one of those days that seem insignificant until what happens on them changes the course of your life. That afternoon, as I sat in the living room going through a couple of emails, I felt the pressure in the air becoming unbearable. I heard voices coming from the kitchen, getting louder by the minute, and couldn't help but approach to listen. Javier and Valeria's words reached my ears like a distant scream that soon turned into an accusation. "I don't understand how you can be so heartless," I heard Valeria say, her voice shaking with anger. "You've intruded on our lives, given us false hope, and now, after everything we've been through, what do? You kick us out like we're strangers. That's not what's happening, and you know it." Javier shot back angrily, his frustration echoing. "We don't understand why you can't help us in the right way. Is it so hard to be a good brother and a good son? Do you have any idea what you're doing?" I couldn't take it anymore. The resentment that had been building up in my chest for weeks came rushing out all at once. Without thinking twice, I got up from my chair and headed straight to the kitchen, interrupting their argument. My presence seemed to be the final straw for everything to come crashing down. "Enough! I don't want to hear any more of this," I said, raising my voice with force. They both fell silent, staring at me with a mix of surprise and defiance. "It's clear that we don't agree, that we have different perspectives, but this is out of control. I can't keep listening to how you blame me for everything that's happening. I have my limits too." The house, which had once been a place of shared life, now felt like a battlefield. My words hit them, in one way or another, and I could see their eyes clouding with frustration. Valeria crossed her arms, making it clear that she wasn't going to budge an inch, while Javier, his face tight with anger, waved his hand as though trying to control his emotions. "You don't know what it's like to be us. You don't know what it's like to be here, seeing doors shut in your face, and having to depend on the mercy of others just to survive. You have no idea," Valeria screamed, now challenging me. "I know more than you think. What I don't understand is why you think I haven't done enough. I haven't done what you wanted, but I've given what I have. The fact that we don't agree doesn't mean I don't care about you or that I don't want to help. But the way you're handling this is wrong," I replied, trying to stay composed as I felt my emotions begin to take over. At that moment, the words felt meaningless. There was so much anger and resentment in the air that everything being said just sounded empty. But I knew I couldn't give in. I couldn't continue letting their problems become an excuse to trample over me and take advantage of my good intentions. The tension reached its peak when Javier, visibly frustrated, threw one final accusation. "You're kicking us out like we're nothing, but one day you'll see. This is going to come back to you. Everything you've done. You have no idea what you're losing by being so stubborn." I stood in silence for a moment. Those words, like poison, seeped into my mind. But no, I wasn't going to let them make me doubt myself. I wasn't going to give in to the pressure, nor was I going to let guilt drag me down. The conflict had spilled over, but it was the only way to make it clear what was at stake. There was no room for further manipulation. What had started as a gesture of goodwill had now turned into a battle for my own well-being, and I wasn't going to lose it. What I've done for you, I did because I wanted to, but I'm not your savior. I'm not your enemy, but I'm also not your solution. The money, the house, the expectations, I don't have to pay for all of that for you. Not anymore. The house, the same one that had once been a refuge, now felt like a minefield, and I had just triggered the first charge. There was no turning back now. The tension became palpable, like the air itself was charged with electricity, waiting to explode. The following days were the hardest. I had done what I believed was necessary, what in my heart I knew I had to do, but at the same time, I couldn't help but feel like I was losing something important. Not because I didn't believe I was right, but because this conflict had touched a deep part of me. Family, loyalty, responsibility. My parents, my brother, they all fell silent after our confrontation. No one knew how to act, no one dared take the next step. The house, already cold and distant, became even more unbearable. Family dinners turned tense, conversations empty, as if just the act of being together had become a burden. Despite all that had been said, the truth was that very little had been resolved. One morning, as I was drinking my coffee in the kitchen, I heard my mother's footsteps. I didn't see her, but I felt her presence. That sensation when you realize someone is near but isn't quite ready to approach. I felt a mixture of sadness and resignation as I heard her move about the house, as if she, too, was trapped in her web of expectations and regrets. When she finally entered the kitchen, her gaze was empty, as if words no longer held weight. Everything was so tense that she didn't even look me in the eye. "Do you know, son?" she said, finally breaking the silence. I never imagined we'd come to this point. Her words weren't an apology, nor were they an acknowledgement of what she had done wrong. It was simply a statement of what could no longer be undone. It was as if, for the first time, she too recognized that our relationship would never be the same. For my part, I had done my part. I had laid all my cards on the table. What was left now was to see whether my family could learn something from all this or if things would simply fall apart. I didn't expect an emotional response. I didn't expect tears or regret. Instead, I decided to do what I do best when I have nothing more to say: disappear into my own thoughts. But my mother didn't leave so easily. She watched me, waiting for a reaction, a gesture that would tell her whether all this suffering had been worth it, whether the sacrifices made had any meaning. I couldn't offer her anything but the calm of my silence, and that was what hurt her most. Sometimes, silence is stronger than any word. The day came when everything exploded once more, but this time, the tension had reached its breaking point. After days of not speaking, one Monday afternoon, Javier showed up at my door, unannounced. It wasn't just any day. Something in his face told me that this time would be different. His expression was lost, as if he had realized something he had been ignoring for all this time. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice that of someone who had hit rock bottom. I invited him in, although deep down, I didn't have high expectations for what was about to happen. I knew this wasn't just a conversation. This was a confrontation, a turning point, and, like everything in life, when things reach their limit, there's no turning back. He sat across from me, but his posture was different. He wasn't defiant or angry like before. This time, there was a vulnerability in his gaze. The arrogant, domineering attitude was gone, and something inside him, a small crack of humanity, was beginning to show. "I was wrong," he admitted without hesitation. I thought we could manipulate you, that we could get you to give us what we wanted, and that was a mistake." His confession left me speechless. I didn't expect a direct apology, let alone from him. But somehow, I understood that this was the first time my brother was acknowledging the gravity of his actions. I knew the damage couldn't be repaired with a simple phrase, but something inside me told me that this was a step, albeit a small one, toward reconciliation. My response was calm, almost measured, as if emotions could no longer overwhelm me. I wasn't going to let myself be dragged into the wave of resentment that still lingered inside me, but neither was I going to allow myself to be trampled again. "I told you there were limits," I responded firmly but without bitterness. Sometimes family is about giving, but also knowing when to let go. And that's what I'm doing. I don't want to keep being part of this destructive cycle. I don't want any more manipulation. I don't want my feelings played with. Javier didn't say anything else. He simply got up and walked toward the door. As I watched him leave, I felt something break inside me, something that could never be fixed, but also something that, in a way, freed me. I didn't watch him leave. I didn't even know if he would come back. The truth was that, from that day forward, nothing would ever be the same. Time passed, and gradually the tension in the house started to fade. The arguments stopped, but so did the smiles. Something was irreparably broken. At first, the feeling of victory had stayed with me, but as the days piled up, I realized that what I had truly gained wasn't peace, but a kind of emptiness. My relationship with my mother and my brother had transformed into something irreparable, and although they tried to reestablish contact, I knew that the price of everything that had happened was no longer just a heated argument. It was the end of something much deeper, something that, while painful, was necessary. In the end, my family left, each to their own place, and I stayed in the house that had always been the refuge. Perhaps that was the lesson we all needed to learn. Family can be both a refuge and a prison, and the hardest thing is knowing when to risk freeing yourself from what's weighing you down, even if that means losing a part of yourself in the process. And that's what I did, and that's how this story ends. Sometimes the endings aren't what we expect, but they always leave us with valuable lessons. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments and tell us your own story. Your comment could make a difference to someone else. And if you want to see more stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. See you next time.